Behold, the master has one who is mighty and strong, like a storm of hail, tempest, destroying, like a storm of waters, mighty, overflowing. He casts down to the earth with a hand. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh. And today we are covering a new section of Isaiah starting in chapter 28. Chapter 28 brings us into a section of Isaiah that is sometimes called the Book of Woes, covering chapters 28 through 33. Now, as I mentioned in our previous section of Isaiah, which was sometimes called the Apocalypse of Isaiah, I'm a little skeptical with some of the common divisions of Isaiah into literary units. There's not necessarily a strong cohesion through this so-called Book of Woes. It's called this because there are 6 prophecies that occur in this section that start out with the word woe, or the Hebrew word hoi. This might indicate some type of a thematic grouping. A woe saying typically begins with this exclamation of hoi, woe, followed by a noun or a participle characterizing the condemned thing that is being addressed for its behavior, implying that a severe threat is being faced by whatever is being condemned. It has been proposed that the word hoi comes from funerary practices, where this was one of the cries of grief that was put out by the mourners of the dead, and that using this word in this context indicates that the thing is considered as good as dead. And that's possible. And there are some spots in the Hebrew Bible itself that seem to support its usage in that context. However, it's not always that simple. Sometimes it's actually used in a fairly positive way. And we could go into that more at some later point. But there are, though, in this section of chapters 28 to 33, 6 different prophecies that all start with this word woe. And we're going to start here with one of them in chapter 28. But as a literary unit, I don't believe it's that cohesive. I think that what we see with Isaiah in this section here is these are a lot of short, independent poems that were gathered by some editor and just placed here together, possibly grouped thematically, but really they probably were generated independent from each other and probably existed in an oral tradition before being committed to writing. So these are things that the prophet probably delivered orally, and these are kind of his, greatest hits, sayings that really stuck with people, but were not necessarily terribly long. And so we get a lot of these short ones placed together here through these chapters that were probably collected by his students, his disciples, and put down into writing as just sort of a collection to preserve his words. Because the prophets generally did not start by writing their messages. They generally presented their messages orally, and then their messages got committed to writing afterwards. Now, Isaiah is a bit of an interesting one there because we do know that he did preserve some of his writings specifically in writing that he then sealed up, and we'll get to some of that as we go through some of this. Many scholars see this section as having originated in the 8th century with the historical Isaiah, with some overlays by later writers who lived in the 7th and 6th centuries. The main thrust of this argument centers around the statements of destruction of Assyria and some of the statements around Jerusalem's fall. The idea is that these would need to have been composed after these events occurred, because seeing the future is not possible. And also hoping for a specific future for some reason seems unlikely. I personally find this endless parsing to be kind of weak, and there simply is not enough evidence to support any theory about the composition of these chapters and settle the matter for good. And so it really does remain a lot in the individual opinion of the scholar as to when these were composed. We simply just have no evidence for Isaiah that is older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date back to the 2nd century BCE. So this sort of gives us the latest date possible. All we can say for certain is that the text had reached very close to its final form by that date. So arguments of composition all center on the dates between the 8th century, when Isaiah lived, and the 3rd century, where it had to have finally been brought into this final form. There's generally broad agreement that these dates can be further narrowed down to about the 8th to the 5th centuries. And so I think everybody pretty much feels that it did reach its final form by the 5th century. but that gives us still a span of about 400 years. Any arguments that are dating parts of the text to specific time frames in that range rely entirely on what we call internal evidence, meaning that they make a close examination of the preserved text itself. They are looking for clues in the language, and they're looking for historical references to kings that may have ruled or other contemporary events that help us know when the writer is living and when they have composed their text. But there simply exists no textual copies or other material evidence to verify or falsify any theory in that range. And so it is purely from parsing the text that scholars come up with dates anywhere in the span of 400 years for when Isaiah was composed. This chapter itself is not exactly a very strongly cohesive literary unit. I break it into 4 parts. Verses 1 through 8, we're going to talk about the drunks, and that's going to be today's video. Then verses 9 through 13, we will talk about teaching children. And the subject, in my opinion, shifts drastically as we move into that, although there are a lot of wide variety and interpretations of that section. Then verses 14 through 22, we will look at the scoffers and the foundation stone. And then verses 23 to 29, we'll try something entirely different and talk about growing crops. So let's start off here with these first 8 verses of this chapter where we talk about the drunks. In verse 1, we started off here with alas. The Hebrew word here is hoy, and this is the word that many translations bring across as woe. I don't feel like alas really gets the feeling of this word. I don't know that woe does either. There's really not quite a way to translate it. I almost would leave it untranslated and just have it be hoy. But we have here, alas, the splendid crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the withering flower of his delightful ornament, which is on the proud fat head of those hammered with wine. So we have here the crown of the pride of Ephraim's drunkards here. Ephraim is the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and it was wiped out by Assyria in 721 BC. This may have been written early on in Isaiah's career, in which case this can be talking about either just before or more likely just after Ephraim has been destroyed by Assyria in 721 BCE. This splendid crown here, it might be a garland of flowers rather than a kingly crown. The word can kind of mean either, and given the context here, I don't think we're talking about a kingly crown here because we're talking about a bunch of drunk people, and I think we're talking about more of decorative flowers in their hair here as they are partying it up. And this goes with the second line where we talk about the withering flower of this delightful ornament. Delightful ornament is just a parallel line. They're renaming the splendid crown. We have here this idea that there is this withering flower of this delightful ornament, as it seems to be an item of merriment that has now started to age and maybe withering and falling apart a bit. Now, the text in its traditional form also says here, upon the head, valley of fatness, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this phrase is repeated twice in this little section here. The Dead Sea Scrolls, both in this occurrence and in its repetition in verse 4, have the word that is translated as valley here, gay, and they have reversed the letters Aleph and Yod. And so now it goes from reading valley to reading proud as an adjective. And that makes it turn into upon the proud fat head rather than upon the head of the fat valley. And that makes a lot more sense. So this, I don't think, is intended to mean fat valley, or also could be translated as valley of oils. The word for fat and oil was kind of the same thing. I think this is meant to be the proud fat head. And I think we are setting up here a little bit of a contrast of Ephraim, who does not survive Assyria, and Judah, who will survive Assyria. Now, some translations put this final line here as those who are overcome with wine. Overcome doesn't quite get it either. I found it humorous that this word that is often translated as overcome actually is a reference to the pounding of horses' hooves. They're hammering their hooves on the ground. And so I just went with what it says, that they were hammered with wine. And it goes nicely with our modern English idiom as well. Overcome just seems too mild to capture this idea of being pounded like horses would pound their hooves on the ground. They are incapacitated. They have been hammered with wine. And then we switch from a focus on the drunkards to looking at the plan of the master here. Behold, the master has one who is mighty and strong, like a storm of hail, a tempest destroying, like a storm of waters mighty, overflowing. He casts down to the earth with his hand. One mighty and strong. This sounds kind of messianic in its approach here. Based on the Syriac text, it looks like these really should have vowels to be participles rather than adjectives, which is how most translations actually tend to render it, that this is one who is mighty and one who is strong. The word for tempest is kind of an unusual spelling, only found here. The word destroying is a word that could indicate a plague, or it could actually be the name of a specific demon. And so this storm may be seen as a supernatural storm of a particular demonic entity. But he has this one who is coming with great destruction, a storm of hail that is a destroying tempest, and it's going to bring waters that overflow. Now, waters overflowing was not a typical imagery in the Judean hill country, but it is one that the prophets use a fair bit. We have here, though, the idea of these great flooding waters and the idea of a destroying storm of hail coming. And so one of the things that is often looked to as the fulfillment of this, of course, is the invading Assyrians. It may be a reference to the Assyrians. It could also be a reference to the Lord himself, of whom Assyria is only the instrument. He could be seen in his role here as a destroying warrior god. But it's going to be in contrast to the verses that are coming up where he is portrayed as a defender. Then we come to a part here where we repeat our opening lines with some changes. Now, the normal verse division here placed this last line, he casts down to the earth with his hand. In part of verse 2 here, I think it works better to put it into verse 3. He casts down to the earth with his hand, will be trodden underfoot the splendid crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. This means that this garland wreath that the drunks are wearing is what he is going to cast down to the ground, and he's going to trod it underfoot. So he's going to take all of their merriment, their withering leaves that have, been from last night's partying. He's going to knock it off their head and send it to the ground. He cast down to the earth with a hand, will be trodden underfoot the splendid crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, and the withering flower of his delightful ornament, which is on the proud fat head, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer, which the seer looks at. While he still has it in his hand, he swallows it. Okay, so there are a few ideas as to what this metaphor is, but what it seems to be saying here is that there is a first ripe fig. There's a word here specifically that indicates the figs that first show up on the tree. And there is a seer, a person who looks at it. You can think of this person as a fruit inspector. He goes in and he looks at this fruit, and while it's still in his hand as he's looking at it, apparently he's going to just pluck it off and swallow it down. He's going to eat it. And so this is possibly a metaphor for these drunks here. This group of drunken Ephraimites here, they're going to get the wreath knocked off their head, and these invaders that are going to come in are going to see them as easy pickings, that they're going to look at it and say, yeah, that fig's ready to go, and just take it and eat it, long before it has its time to develop into its full harvest potential. And then we contrast that in verse 5. And this is some part here that some might see as a later addition to try and not be so harsh in the previous one, because this little interlude here does seem to inject itself right in the middle of what is otherwise a fairly negative prophecy here. But in verse 5, we have a definite shift of focus and says, in that day, The Lord of hosts will be for a delightful crown and for a diadem of adornment to the remnant of his people, and for a spirit of justice for him who sits upon the judgment seat, and for strength to those who turn back the battle at the gate. So these are some very tightly woven poetic lines here. The false crown that is adorning the drunkards is replaced with a true crown that God becomes for his people. The phrase here, delightful crown, combines the words that were used of the drunkard's crown before, but in a different way. We take the 4 different words that were used there and we recombine them in different orders here. It is a powerful contrast between the weak leaders of Ephraim, who were human leaders who wear a crown they do not deserve, with a divine crown defined by justice and strength. Justice in the form of a righteous society that cares for the weak and the poor, and strength to fight off and defend the city at the gate. In fact, both these things are kind of associated with the city's gate. The city's gates were the courts of justice. That's where it was commonly held. And also, it is a place of strength where if you are defending the city, the gate is the key focal area that armies will attack. And so both those who deliver justice in the gate and those who fight back the enemies in the gate are listed here as those who are deserving of a true crown. But then we seem to turn back to the idea of the drunkards of Ephraim in verse 7. We seem to no longer be on this positive note, which again, some may see as a later intrusion to try and make this prophecy more palatable, or it could just be that prophets are prophets and sometimes they switch the subjects. But in verse 7 here it says, and also these reel with wine and stagger with strong drink. Priest and prophet reel with strong drink and are swallowed by wine. They stagger with strong drink. They reel with the seer. They juttered judgment. This may be an explanatory gloss of the entire prophecy here to define who are these drunkards. And it kind of reads that way. But it's explaining here, these are the ones who are reeling with wine and staggering with strong drink. And it lists here priest and prophet. Those are the ones that are reeling with strong drink and interestingly are swallowed by wine. This word swallowed is the same word we saw of the fruit inspector, that he swallowed the fruit. It now here has the drunkards being swallowed by their wine. And then it says here, they reel with the seer. The seer, again, is the word that we used for the fruit inspector. But now it no longer looks like the fruit inspector. It looks like it is a prophetic calling of a seer, one who sees, which was a title for prophets. So we are playing off of the idea of the fruit inspector who comes in and sees the fruits ready to be taken, the one who sees the fruit, to now the seer who sees the future. Now, the word strong drink that is used here constantly is the word shakar, which is possibly a type of beer. And some have also supposed that it might be a type of brandy called grappa. I don't know a whole lot about brandy, but it doesn't seem like it's ordinary wine here. This is probably a grain-based drink that is essentially beer. And it feels a little like Isaiah is wanting to flex his vocabulary here a little bit. He introduces 2 rare words here. He puts in a third word that is essentially a synonym with stagger and stumble that he's already used. So he has a third word here that means to stagger or stumble. And then he also introduces another word here that we believe means to render a legal decision. And that word is only used here. And when we say here, they juttered judgment, I actually got that idea for a translation from Robert Alter's translation, which is similar. And it emulates the alliteration in the Hebrew, which is pahu pelilia. And this is an unusual combination. It's obviously done for its sound play. And so they juttered judgment. They made an unsteady decision is kind of what it is here. They rendered a legal decision that was unsteady. And so that's what we're trying to capture in that. Basically, Isaiah is saying, after praising those who make good judgments and who turn back the enemies at the gate, that there are these people that are quite problematic, that these drunkards that he's talking about are probably more symbolic of overconfidence and poor leadership more than actual drunkenness, although they might be actual drunks as well. But it does seem that they have a prophet problem. It is apparently the religious leaders that are leading them down a dangerous path. He is particularly down on prophets and priests and seers. And so he puts out this kind of condemnation, explaining that the drunkards of Ephraim who will have the crown knocked off their head are these religious leaders who have misled the people. And he ends it with a very explicit explanation here. For all the tables are full of vomit excrement and no space left. There's no conjunction there between vomit and excrement. It just says they're full of vomit excrement. The initial notion of drunkenness is now vividly joined with a disgusting scene of filth and debauchery. The word obviously in Hebrew means excremental filth, and we've got vomit and excrement. It kind of seems like we're getting filth coming from both ends in this, if you understand what I mean. And it fills everything. There's no place. And meaning that there's no place clean, which some translations do add for clarity in there, but the Hebrew just simply says there is no place. And so that brings us to the end of our first 8 verses. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe so you can get the other 3 sections of Isaiah chapter 28, which will be coming out soon. And in the next one, we're going to talk about something completely different.